all the times I've let God down. I am humbled by the grace He has extended. I'm amazed at the mercy I have found. I could never earn His love on my own, yet every time I come before His throne, I stand redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. I stand redeemed before the great I am. When He looks at me, He sees the nail-scarred hands that bought my liberty. I stand redeemed. Even at my best, I am unworthy. I have nothing precious I can give. A broken life is all I have to offer, and yet it is a priceless gift to Him. The bitter mark of sin will never fade away, but I can come before Him unashamed. I stand redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. I stand redeemed before the great I am. When He looks at me, He sees the nail-scarred hands that bought my liberty. I stand redeemed. When He looks at me, He sees the nail-scarred hands that bought my liberty. I stand redeemed. I stand redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. I stand redeemed before the great I am. When He looks at me, He sees the nail-scarred hands that bought my liberty. I stand redeemed. I stand redeemed. I stand redeemed.
Let's turn our Bibles this morning to John chapter number 18. John chapter number 18. If you'd like to follow along with the sermon, you can scan the QR code on the screen behind me as well as in the bulletin. John chapter number 18 in our Bibles this morning. We have arrived to the morning of Jesus' crucifixion. At the beginning of John 18, we saw that Judas had betrayed Jesus and that Jesus Christ had been arrested by the Jewish officers. It tells us in verse number 12 of John 18, "Then the band of the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound Him." The word "then" could mean a transition of time, but in my mind it means more. I look at it as only then. Only after Jesus Christ had taken control of the situation. Only after Jesus was willing to give Himself. Only after Jesus had demonstrated His power by healing Malchus's ear and by restoring Malchus's ear, was only then, only after Jesus Christ had taken control, were they able to arrest Jesus Christ. Because Jesus' life was not taken from Him. Jesus laid His life down. He was willing to give it. But how were the Jewish and the Roman people going to be able to get to the point where they could crucify Jesus Christ? neither the Jewish nor the Roman governments were perfect. But they had a set of laws that they followed. You weren't allowed to just murder someone that you didn't like. You couldn't just use the government to kill people that you didn't agree with. They had rules. There had to be a justified reason for the taking of a life. But Jesus Christ was perfect. Jesus Christ never sinned. Jesus Christ never did anything wrong. How were they going to kill him? How were they going to get to the point of putting him to death? How were they legally going to get rid of him? And as we step through this farce of a trial of Jesus Christ this morning, we're going to see three main characters in this event. The high priest of Israel, represented by Annas and Caiaphas. The disciple of Jesus, represented by Peter. And the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. And through each of these men, we're going to see the part that they played in the trial of Jesus Christ. The first act that we see is that of deception by Annas and Caiaphas, the high priest of Israel. It says in verse number 12, "Then the band and the captains of the officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him, and led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. It was Caiaphas, after Jesus Christ had raised Lazarus from the dead, that prophesied that he must die to be able to rescue these people. He must die, or we're going to lose everything to the Roman people." It can become confusing as you read through this passage. You look down in verse number 19. It says, "The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine." And it goes to a conversation with him. And then it goes down to verse number 24. "Now Annas, the one that was having the conversation, had sent him bound unto Caiaphas, the high priest." And so in this passage we find that both Annas and Caiaphas were mentioned as the high priest of Israel during this time. There's historical evidence that Annas had been the high priest before Caiaphas. But it seems that he was dismissed from this position by the Roman government following a dispute with the people, which caused the Romans to then get rid of Annas and install his son-in-law, Caiaphas, to be the high priest. But the Jewish people, they didn't accept this decision by the Romans. They said, "You have no right to declare to us who our high priest should be." And so to the Jewish people, Annas remained the high priest of Israel. But to the Romans, Caiaphas was now the high priest of Israel. This created the situation where when Annas would make a decision as the high priest of Israel that required Roman consent, he had to pass it along to Caiaphas, who would then go to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. But to the Jews, Annas was the legitimate high priest. And so when Jesus Christ was arrested, the Jewish officers first took him to their high priest, to Annas. And when Jesus answered a question, as we saw in verse number 22, and it says, Jesus answered, the officer asked of Jesus, "Answerest thou the high priest so?" And in verse 24, "Now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas." The Jewish people, the officers, recognized Annas as their high priest. But Annas knew that the Jews had no right to kill Jesus Christ. They weren't allowed under Roman law, which they were bound to commit capital punishment. They knew they had to go through the Romans to kill Jesus. Therefore, Annas sent Jesus to his son-in-law, to Caiaphas, who was then able to take him to the Romans for trial and for execution. When Jesus was first brought to Annas, Annas began looking for a reason that he could use to bring Jesus to Pilate and execute him. It says in verse number 19, "Then the high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine." I believe he asked him of his disciples to find out what he had been teaching his disciples. What were they believing? Were his disciples an army that he was raising up to be able to overthrow the Roman government? That would give him reason to be able to execute Jesus Christ. This would be a logical conclusion, that Jesus would be raising up an army. The Jewish people viewed the Messiah as the conquering king, as one that would ride into Jerusalem and liberate them from their Jewish oppressor, or for their Gentile Pharaoh oppressors. And so they viewed the Messiah as a king that would raise up an army. And so he assumed that the disciples were also going to be following. And if they were following, looking to overthrow the Roman government, he could bring them to Pontius Pilate and say, see, you need to get rid of this guy. He's causing problems. His disciples are going to try to rise up with him and to overthrow your government. And that would give them perfect reason to execute him. But if Jesus Christ were indeed raising up an army, then the Jewish people of his time would have been excited about it. They were already, the Sunday before, receiving him, hailing him as their king as he rode into Jerusalem on the donkey. They had just heard about how he raised Lazarus from the dead. He had to be the Messiah. And now he's raising up an army. If they hear that the disciples are the soldiers and that he's raising up an army, the Jewish people are going to be excited about it. They're going to follow him. And so Annas decided he needed to find something wrong with his doctrine. Something that he could point to the Jewish people and say, yes, he proclaims to be the Messiah. But he can't be the Messiah because of this teaching, and this teaching, and this teaching. And so Annas was looking for a way. He was looking for a reason to get rid of Jesus Christ to both the Romans and to the Jewish people. And Jesus Christ basically looks at Annas and he tells him, stop fishing, Annas. He says in verse number 21, why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me. What I have said unto them, behold, they know what I said. In verse number 20, Jesus Christ said, I have ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. Jesus Christ tells Annas, he says, I have not been bashful. Everything I've taught in the open. He had spent all week long in the temple teaching. And Annas knew this. This whole week, the Jewish religious leaders had been trying to trip Jesus up over his doctrine, but they couldn't find anything. And so Jesus simply looks at Annas and says, leave me alone. Go talk to the other people. Go and get some witnesses for the accusations that you're making. See, both Jesus and Annas knew that what was being done to Jesus Christ on this morning was illegal. It was illegal under Jewish law to bring someone to trial without an accusation. It was illegal to try someone without a witness. And so Jesus Christ confronts Annas on the illegality. And he tells him to go get some witnesses and make an accusation. Stop arresting me and then trying to find a reason for why you have arrested me. You need to do this right. You need to have an accusation and you need to have a witness. But Annas was such a powerful man. Nobody ever talked to him this way. And so when Jesus spoke of this soldier that was there, it tells us in verse number 22, struck Jesus with the palm of his hand and said, how dare you speak to Annas that way, the high priest? And Jesus says in verse 23, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why smitest thou me? What did I say wrong? What did I say wrong? You are hitting me. You're accusing me of saying something wrong. Tell me the evil thing that I have said. But of course, the guard could not respond. He knew that the guilty party in this situation was Annas, the high priest, and not Jesus Christ. And so unable to get anything out of Jesus, Annas sends Jesus to his son-in-law, the Jewish high priest recognized by the Romans, Caiaphas. Annas knows that he needs to get to work, trumping up some charges against Jesus Christ so that he can get rid of him. It tells us in the Gospel of Mark, under his account of this event, it says, and the chief priests and all the council sought for witnesses against Jesus to put him to death and found none. Of course not. He was perfect. He did nothing wrong. If you looked hard enough, you could find some things I've done wrong in life. You just ask me, I'll tell you some of the stupid things I've done in life. But Jesus Christ never did anything wrong. He never sped. He never did a California roll at a stop sign. He never did anything wrong. He did everything right. And so they couldn't find anything against him. It says they looked for witnesses. They found none. For many bear false witness against him. But their witness agreed not together. Even the lies they were making up couldn't come together. And there arose certain and bear false witness against him. The Jewish high priests were using deception to get rid of Jesus Christ. That was the only way they could do it. There was no legitimate way to get rid of him. And so they found people and they deceived others to get rid of Jesus Christ. A second character that we find in this passage, an act that we find, is the act of denial by Peter. After Jesus' arrest, Peter and another unnamed disciple followed Jesus to the high priest's house. It tells us in verse 15. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door without. Then went out that other disciple, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. Then saith the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, art not thou also one of this man's disciples? And he saith, I am not. The testimony of the other disciple here is amazing. In this event, we often focus on Peter and his act of denial, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But this other disciple, he was not denying anything. He was well known in this area as a follower of Jesus Christ. He was known by the leadership that he was a follower of Jesus Christ. He was known by the high priest as a follower of Jesus Christ. He was known by the doorkeeper. It says in verse number 16, it says, this woman spoke unto Peter and said, art thou also one of his disciples? In verse 17, art thou also one of this man's disciples? She knew that this other man, whoever it was, possibly John, was a follower of Jesus Christ. And so she asked Peter, are you also following Jesus Christ? Here was a man that was bold for Jesus Christ. Here was a man that was not denying Jesus Christ. Here was a man that made it known that he followed Jesus Christ. He was a disciple of Jesus. But Peter, on the other hand, was in full denial. You read through this passage, and it seems interesting to me about Peter's denial is it doesn't seem that anybody is really out to get Peter here. As they accuse him and they ask him questions, it doesn't seem like they're really trying to attack him. We find the first lady in verse number 17. It was just the doorkeeper, and says, art thou not also one of this man's disciples? It seems that she's just asking, are you also one of his disciples? Maybe she's wondering what's happening with Jesus Christ. And she says, are you with him as well? Do you know what's going on? Are you following him as well? And Peter says, no. I'm not me. I just know the other guy here. Let me in. I don't know anything about this Jesus guy. I don't know who he is. Then the Bible tells us in the book of Luke that some time goes by. Maybe some of the servants and soldiers are outside by the fire discussing what's going on. Maybe they don't know about what's happening. Maybe they're curious about Jesus Christ, and they see Peter standing there by a fire, and they don't recognize him. He's warming himself by the fire, and they go ask him about what's happening inside. Perhaps they ask him why Jesus was arrested. Maybe the servant girl tells them that she thinks Peter also knows Jesus. And so they come and they ask him. In verse number 18, it says, and the servants and the officers stood there, and they had made a fire of coals, and it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. And it says in verse 25, and Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. And they said therefore unto him, art thou not thou also one of his disciples? He denied it and said, I am not. No, I'm not one of his disciples. Now a little bit more time goes by, about an hour. Now a relative of Malchus, the man whose ear had been cut off in the garden by Peter, has been made aware of Peter's presence. Maybe the servants have been discussing what was happening on the inside to Jesus, how he was being beaten. And maybe Malchus' relative here is sharing about what had happened in the garden, how Jesus said the words, I am, and they all went flying back, and they're discussing what's going on. And maybe someone points over at Peter to Malchus' relative, and he says, hey, that guy right there, he's surely one of the disciples of Jesus. He's not from around here. He speaks like Jesus does. He speaks like he has that Galilean accent. And Malchus' relative looks up and he sees Peter standing over there, and he instantly recognizes him. And it says in verse 26, and one of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, saith, did not I see thee in the garden with him? Yeah, I saw you. You're the guy that took that sword and you swung it at my relatives, at Malchus' head, and you tried to cut his head off, and he ducked and he cut his ear off, and I saw Jesus pick it up. You are that guy. And Peter, it says in verse number 27, Peter then denied again, and immediately the cock crew. The book of Matthew tells us at that point that Peter begins cursing. And he emphatically states that he doesn't even know who Jesus Christ is. And in that moment, the cock crows. And Matthew tells us that when the cock crew, Peter remembered the words of Jesus Christ, that he would deny him. It seems that at this very moment that they were leading Jesus Christ across the courtyard, maybe to another room, maybe back to see Caiaphas, or perhaps to a holding cell. And Peter looks up as they're bringing Jesus Christ across, and he denies him, and he locks eyes with him. And he sees Jesus Christ. And Peter is crushed. The Bible tells us in the Gospel of Luke that he runs out. He's broken. He's weeping. He's hurt. Because he denied Jesus Christ. This is a heartbreaking series of events. Peter went from bravely defending Jesus Christ, the only one to pull out his sword, ready to fight for Jesus, to in just a few hours denying Jesus Christ, even to a little lady. Peter arrogantly went from saying that he'll never deny Jesus Christ to weeping bitterly because he denied Jesus just a few hours later. You know, it's amazing how fast things can change in our life. It's amazing how you can go from a great, bold Christian to a cowering denier in just a couple of hours. I feel bad for Peter here. But you know, God was preparing Peter. God was working in his life. Peter was not at the point where he was emotionally or spiritually ready to be where God needed him to be yet. He needed to be broken, and it seems that Peter needed this experience of brokenness in order to become useful to God. Brokenness often comes before usefulness. When we are full of ourselves, when we're confident in ourselves, in our own ability, then we're useless to God. We're useless to God. It's only when we understand our desperate need of God that we can become useful to Him. We often want to be used like Peter, don't we? We often want to be the ones that stand on the day of Pentecost and preach and see 3,000 people get saved. How awesome must that have been? We often want to be the one that walks by that man that was crippled and say, "Silver and gold have I none, but in the name of Jesus Christ, stand up and walk." And the man stands up, jumping and leaping for joy. We want to be used like Jesus Christ, or like Peter. But we don't want to be broken like Peter was broken. We don't want to go through those hard times, those difficult times that bring us to the point where we know we are in desperate need of God's help. May we ask God to help us learn from Peter's example and to be humble enough without having to go through the experience of deep brokenness. That's a great way to go. But if we have to be broken, may we ask God to give us grace to come through it like Peter did. It was hard for him. It was difficult for him. And he went through times of deep trial. As Jesus was under trial, he was broken because he was denying Jesus Christ. A third character and act that we find in this passage is that of defeat in Pilate. Having found their false witnesses against Jesus, the Jewish religious leaders now believe they have what they need to be able to bring Jesus Christ before Pilate and to get him killed. And the hypocrisy of the religion and the religiosity of the Jewish leaders at this time is unbelievable. It says in verse number 28, "Then led they Jesus from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early. And they themselves," notice this, "went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover." They were willing to lie. They were willing to trump up some false accusations against Jesus Christ to get him killed. But they didn't want to walk into to Pontius' house, because then they would be unclean. And then they wouldn't be able to participate in the Jewish ceremony of the Passover. These same Jewish leaders would later cheer for the release of a murderer and a thief, and Barabbas, as you can read at the end of the chapter here. And they would celebrate the condemnation of an innocent man in Jesus Christ. The religious Jewish leaders, they had no desire for righteousness, only that they appeared to be righteous. They had no desire for justice. They only had the desire for power. They placed their personal desires over doing what was right. They didn't have really any passion to do what was right. They had no desire to live a godly life. They just wanted everyone else to think they did. And there's a lot of people that go to church like that in our day and world. They would just come to church and they want everyone to think that they're a godly Christian. They have a smile on their face. They have a Bible under their arm. They walk into church. They all look good. They act. They sing songs. And everyone thinks that person is spiritual. But they go home and there's no righteousness. There's no desire for righteousness in their lives. And that was these Jewish leaders. They were hypocrites. They said, we can't go into Pontius' house because then everyone would know we're unclean and then we can't participate in the ceremony and then we can't do this. Oh, but we're okay to lie against Jesus Christ and to be able to bring Him into crucifixion with false accusations. All they wanted was power and control in their life, an appearance of holiness. I also read through this event and I find myself feeling bad for Pontius Pilate in this event. It tells us in chapter 19 and verse 12, and from thenceforth Pilate sought to release him. He knew that the Jews had brought Jesus to him under false pretenses. He wanted nothing to do with condemning this man. He listened to Jesus Christ talk and he was impacted by him. His wife had warned him not to do anything to Jesus after a dream that she had had. And everything that he did to try to get rid of Jesus, the religious leaders were there to shoot him down. They were relentless. But Pilate was not completely innocent in this. Yes, he was trying to release Jesus, but he was not completely innocent. His responses and actions illustrate the difficulty that we can have in reaching people with the gospel in our day and time. Pilate believed in a multiplicity of gods, and he believed in the philosophy over everything. He didn't believe in a creator God nor the creator God's laws. And so therefore, when Jesus shared truth with him, of who he was, Pilate had a hard time grasping it. It says in verse 37, Pilate therefore said unto him, Art thou a king then? And Jesus answered, Thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Everyone that is of the truth hears my voice. And then notice Pilate's response in verse 38. Pilate said unto him, What is truth? When he had said this, he went out again unto the Jews, and saith unto them, I find in him no fault at all. He stated, What is truth? Man, doesn't that sound like our society today? What is truth? What's a woman? What's right and what's wrong? I mean, what's 2 plus 2 nowadays? Everything is relative. You've heard the phrase, you've got to live your truth. I just got to live my truth. There is no your truth and my truth. There is only the truth. And we live in a world today that is so focused on just doing what is pleasing to them. It's true to them, so it must be true. And that's not the case. There is only the truth. And Pilate was a man that didn't believe in a truth. He didn't believe in the truth of the Word of God. He didn't believe when Jesus Christ spoke of the truth. This was Pilate. He lived in a way that he could see that Jesus Christ was a way for some people, but not the way for all people. He was a good person, but maybe he was not what he was proclaiming to be. What is truth? I mean, what is it out there? And that's how our world lives in today. Pilate knew what was being done to Jesus was wrong. But he didn't stop it. He tried. He had the power to. He tried to get away with it. He tried to make it as easy as possible. But when it came down to it, he didn't stop it. He told the Jewish religious leaders to deal with it on their own. He tried to put Jesus up against a murderer like Barabbas to have him released. He tried to mock Jesus and then release him. He tried to beat Jesus and then release him. He knew that killing Jesus Christ would be the wrong thing to do. But what is truth? And what is really wrong? Pilate was more interested in self-preservation than he was in peace and justice. So despite his efforts, he was defeated. He was not able to keep Jesus Christ from being crucified. That was Pilate's life. He had the power, but he wasn't willing to stop it. How could an innocent man like Jesus Christ be tried, condemned, and crucified? Through deception and through defeat. The high priest was willing to do whatever it took, even lie, to get rid of Jesus and to keep his power. The Pontius Pilate was willing to accept defeat, even though he knew it was wrong. As the famous quote states, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. When you are driven by lust and power like the religious leaders, and you're not led by a moral compass of absolute truth like Pontius Pilate, it leads to innocent people being treated unfairly and even killed. This morning, this Friday morning of Jesus Christ's arrest, the morning of a sham trial and crucifixion, it's heartbreaking. Even Jesus' most prominent disciple would deny knowing Jesus Christ. Everything looks bleak at this moment, and it's only going to get worse. Thankfully, we know the rest of the story. We know how it ends. Defeat will turn into triumph. The disciple who denied Jesus will become a bold witness for Jesus Christ. The ones who falsely accuse Jesus will one day bow the knee and confess with their tongue that he is indeed the Christ, the Lord, the Son of God. Every knee will bow to him. Every tongue will confess that he is God. The man who denied the existence of truth would be confronted with the reality of truth when Jesus Christ triumphantly rose from the grave to show that he is the way, the truth, and the life. We know how the story ends. Our God is a God who can overcome all deception. Our God is a God who can overcome all denial. Our God is a God who can overcome all defeat. He wins, despite how bleak things may look right now. Our responsibility and our job is to make sure that we're living in a way that brings glory and honor to God. That we don't use deception in our lives. How is it that bad things happen? We're using deception to get away with things, to try to get things the way that we want it. I want this raise, so I'm going to deceive other people to be able to get it. That's what the religious leaders did. We don't deny Jesus Christ, no matter what it could cost us. Could it have cost Peter his life? Sure. Sure it could have. But he needed to be bold for Jesus Christ. We must not deny. And we must not accept defeat. Yes, things can look bleak. Yes, it could seem that everyone else is against us. Yes, it could seem that trials come our way and it seems everyone's going against. Yes, it seems like our country is changing for a radical way that many people are not pleased with. And yes, it can seem that defeat is on the way. But our God wins. He overcomes death. He overcomes the grave. He overcomes hell. He overcomes all the devices of man. He's a God who wins. And so we must live in victory today. Never denying Jesus Christ and never using deception, but living knowing that our God wins. Our God is the one who can overcome all deception, all denial, and all defeat. And I hope you know this truth. And I hope that you're living this truth and that you're trusting Jesus Christ today, the one who gives victory, even when things look awful, even when everyone else is against him. Let us pray. Father, thank you for your word.
Thank you for joining us for part of a Sunday service at Community Baptist Church. I hope to meet you soon. May God impress His love upon your heart this week.